we found is that most residents of affordable housing and affordable senior housing, rather than paying this monthly cost to park off-street, they'll just look for parking on-street. Low-income households own fewer cars, so this problem is not as acute as we might find in market-rate housing. And this is especially true in transit-served areas. And when I say transit, we're talking about subways, buses, and as we get into the areas where we're proposing to apply these regulations, we can talk a little bit more in detail about how this is sort of defined. So both lower-income households own fewer cars, especially near transit, and low-income seniors own extremely few. And I'm specifically talking about low-income seniors in rent-regulated housing. So these are seniors living in age-restricted and rent-regulated housing. We've spoken to a number of operators who report that low-income residents rarely park in these facilities, and as a matter of public policy and sort of respect for taxpayer subsidies, we don't think that it's appropriate to be requiring $30,000 conservatively, $30,000 for 20 or 30% of units when residents simply are not parking in them. To put this in a little bit of context, when HPD subsidizes the development of an affordable housing unit, they typically kick in $65,000 to $75,000 per unit. They're not subsidizing the cost of parking. That money has to be found elsewhere, but just to give you a ballpark sense of the cost of building parking versus what HPD subsidizes for an entire residential unit, it really puts things sort of into perspective into how much of the cost of development goes into parking. We've heard from a variety of operators, as I mentioned, that the parking is often unused, and this is, again, not to say that people don't own any cars, they're just not parking in the off-street spaces. They're finding cheaper parking or free parking on-street. So we've spoken extensively with a number of operators. Catholic Charities of Brooklyn and Queens, the largest developer of affordable housing for low-income seniors, had this to say: we have thousands and thousands of low-income seniors on our wait list for housing. We even have wait lists for our tenant gardens. We do not have a single wait list for parking. We've had senior housing developments with 80,000 applicants. Many of them might have owned cars. The vast majority do not. And when you have wait lists, or when you have application lists as long as that, and you have the cost of providing parking eating up such a substantial chunk of developments when we clearly have a need for additional units, again, as I mentioned, as a matter of public policy on our end, we just can't see a reason to justify our requirements. That being said, we are proposing to make parking optional, so I'll get into some of that. So under the proposal, we are designating a geography called the transit zone, and there's a map on the next slide, where we have found auto ownership and commutes by car to be low, especially among the populations that we're targeting through the proposal. And again, we're only talking about affordable and affordable senior housing units. Parking would be optional for new inclusionary housing or low-income housing for the units that qualify as low-income. So if you have an inclusionary housing building that has 80% market rate and 20% affordable, or under the mandatory program the ratios might be different, parking would still be required for the market rate units, but it would be optional for those units that are allocated for low-income households. Where appropriate throughout the city, we're also proposing other modifications, including within the transit zone, removal of parking for existing affordable senior housing, and by discretionary action for other affordable and mixed income housing, a reduction of requirements made possible only on a case-by-case basis by discretionary action. So, looking at what the transit zone is. First, it includes only districts that allow multifamily housing. We're not changing any regulations in single-family districts. These are dense neighborhoods with a variety of public transportation options. They're generally within a half mile of a subway station. They're always within multiple bus lines. But most importantly, these are geographies that reflect existing low car ownership rates within the transit zone. We are not suggesting that people who own cars can give up their car because they live near a subway. We completely appreciate the fact that the subway doesn't get you from point A to point B necessarily. We're not trying to change people's behaviors. We're trying to update zoning to reflect existing habits and existing ownership patterns. there is a correlation between car ownership rates among all household types and things like proximity to transit, but also things like density and housing and proximity to other services and bus lines. And all of these things are found, all of these characteristics are defined by the transit zone. So, I just want to sort of, we can talk about transit access, and it's certainly something that we should be talking about, especially in Queens, but I do just want to sort of like drive home the point, no pun intended, that that the transit zone reflects areas where we see current low rates of car ownership, where we see the highest costs to provide parking because this is typically dense infill development, and where we see generally better access to goods and services simply by virtue of population and sort of the denser built environment. So moving on to the second piece of this overall proposal of zoning for quality and affordability is the quality component. Again, it's threefold. One, to encourage better ground floor retail and residential spaces and apartments with adequate ceiling heights. Two, change the rules that lead to flat, dull apartment buildings to encourage visual variety and features common in traditional apartment buildings. And three, maintain rules that work well today, including the essential rules of contextual zoning districts and lower density zoning districts. So let me also just be clear that everything that I spoke about in the previous slides really relate only to affordable and affordable senior housing. Everything I'm going to talk about deals with all types of residential development, primarily in medium and high density zoning districts. So first, why does zoning need to change? I alluded to this earlier, but our existing building envelopes, even for market rate buildings, are a little bit too small to facilitate good development. One of the things that we know makes Queens great is a lot of the older style buildings that have great courtyards and recesses and bay windows. Those buildings cannot be built today under our existing zoning envelope. Those buildings were built before contextual zoning. They were built before a lot of additional things that we consider to be good, like ADA access, and other things like that have sort of started eating away at what can fit in a building. We don't see a need to sacrifice things like ADA access, for example, or fire prevention, sprinklers and things like that take up space within a building. We haven't updated our building envelope. This is something we'd like to do. However, in the meantime, since we haven't updated our building envelope, we get buildings that look like these. And here's an example of an affordable housing development in Queens on Jamaica Avenue, where again you get floor to ceiling heights that are squashed. You get flat, dull buildings that don't have any room in the building envelope to provide bay windows or any sort of setback. You have residential uses on the ground floor which have to be barred, and they close their curtains, and it's awkward for the pedestrian to be looking into a unit, and it's awkward for the residents to be looking out at pedestrians. All of these things are not just sort of by accident. These are direct results of our zoning being outdated. And so the changes that I'm going to be talking about in the next couple of slides are designed really to just encourage better buildings. The first key element of the proposal is to encourage better ground floor retail and residential spaces and apartments with adequate ceiling heights. So what this means in medium and high density contextual districts, we want to allow limited additional height if buildings provide taller ground floors. And what this means is no more than 5 feet of additional height in more than 95% of the affected zoning districts in the city. 5 feet is actually enough to create a better building. You get better floor to ceiling heights, you get better ground floor to ceiling heights, which is especially important if you want to tenant the ground floor with a quality retailer. And we would also be, again, introducing a cap on the number of stories. So we're not telling you could build 5 additional feet, but you can still squash your floors, and maybe you get an extra floor out of it, and you just get one more floor of sort of like poorly designed residential units. By introducing a cap on the number of stories, we are, again, sort of freeing up the existing building, or the proposed building envelope, to fit the same number of units that are allowed today, but just with a little bit of additional breathing room. So what our current rules today do on commercial streets is the restrictive envelope results in a flat facade. The tight height limits produce low ground floors that are often too short for quality retail space. We see this in a number of vacant ground floor retail spaces in HPD buildings and in other buildings where they really are trying to fit all of their floor area into a restrictive envelope, and you get ground floor to ceiling heights that most retailers just simply don't want to pay for. So what we're proposing to do, again, with only 5 feet, we think we can get a more flexible envelope that allows articulation, it creates visual interest, and by putting that 5 feet on the ground floor, we can encourage better retail spaces. We think they'll be better tenanted, and we overall think that it's a very, very marginal trade-off for something that we think we can get a lot of good out of. Also, in medium and high density contextual zoning districts, we want to change the rules that lead to flat dull apartment buildings, and encourage visual variety and features common in traditional apartment buildings. And again, these are the types of buildings that we see all over Queens, and that we love. We want to allow buildings to set back a few feet from the sidewalk and provide garden areas in the front of the building. These front plantings would be required. So despite the building being set back a few feet, we would simply be offsetting some of the green space in the back for the front for everybody to enjoy. Allow more flexibility for courtyards, bay windows, and other features typical of the city's older buildings, things that really zoning doesn't allow today. And then with targeted changes to setback and coverage requirements, we would be allowing better interior layouts and reducing blank walls. Little things like courtyards means that you may actually be able to build more 3-bedroom units, for example. Since every bedroom needs a window, by allowing things like courtyards, you can actually fit another bedroom into a floor, into a column in a building, because you've suddenly created a whole new row with windows. So our current rules in our contextual zoning districts, here's an R6B district. This is really a typical building that we see built in a contextual district today. Because there's little flexibility permitted for design articulation, we get flat facades, none of the bay windows or the features that we like from some of our more historic buildings. Units built directly on the ground floor that are completely at eye level with pedestrians. They don't have this sort of stoop structure where you can set some of the residential units up a couple of feet off the street. The buildings don't line up with the historic context, again, because they're sort of required by virtue of their tight envelope to be built to the street wall. We get, despite this being a contextual zoning district, buildings that really do look quite out of context with their historical neighbors. Under the proposal, by giving flexibility and the limited flexibility in height, we'd be allowing for changes to setback, changes to the ways developers can build things like bay windows, and we'd be allowing the ground floor units to be elevated a little bit off the sidewalk and set back so that plantings can be provided. So a couple of things on what the proposal would not do. We've learned over the past several months that there's a lot of misinformation out there, and so we think it's worth just a quick mention of the various things that this proposal is not going to do. We're not going to be adding any additional market rate floor area. We are not proposing any provisions that we think would encourage tear downs, despite very marginal increases in floor area for affordable senior housing, certain types, and despite some modest increases in height, we're not actually, inducing development on any existing building that might not develop in the future anyway. There would be no elimination of any contextual zoning district or no remapping of any zoning district that's in place today. That would happen, if that's going to happen, as an entirely separate ULURP process that would be heard by a community. All projects in historic districts or landmark buildings would remain subject to review by the Landmarks Preservation Commission, so we are not going to be overriding the power that LPC currently has today. I mentioned this earlier, but there's no change to any as-of-right residential rules in 1 and 2 family districts. There'd be no reduction in the amount of green space or open spaces required for buildings. And we really do not think that this proposal would produce dramatic changes in the development of any neighborhood. The vast majority of the components of this proposal are designed to encourage affordable senior housing. There are a number of things other than zoning that regulate the development of these types of housing units, funding being the first and foremost. Building affordable senior housing is not going to suddenly become more lucrative than building market rate housing, and we just don't expect that modest increases in height or floor area or changes to our parking requirements would suddenly open the doors to like a mass, overflow of affordable senior housing. So we've made some changes since the proposal was first announced. The first, to focus more squarely on the core goals of quality and affordability. We've reduced some of the proposed additional heights for R8B, R7A, and R6B districts. We have heard from concerned communities. We've also done a little bit of additional research ourselves that we think that this is appropriate. We're making the additional 5 feet of height available only to buildings that provide taller ground floors. And to ensure a transparent public process, we've extended the comment period on our environmental scope. This was back in March. We have draft zoning text and community profiles on the DCP website, so I encourage everybody, if you want to home in on the specifics of how this proposal affects your community board, go to our website. You can click on your community board and get all of the information. We hosted a number of community board info sessions before public review. Excellent. Yeah. So the public review process doesn't vary much from what Eric walked through earlier. We have 60 days for community board review. Danielle mentioned this is the end of, takes us into the end of November. We'll take your comments even through early December. It goes back to the City Planning Commission for about 60 days of review, and then City Council review for another 50 days. It will be traveling along with the MIH proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. So, if I could just ask, now that we've had time to study this, and this may be self-evident to you, so I apologize if it's self-evident to everybody else. I'm unclear as to how the parking will work, right? So, no, seriously, like, so if we're building, like it's an 80-20, let's just say, and so 80% of the units are going to be required to have a parking requirement, and 20% will not. What happens practically, or what is your vision of what happens practically when